I'm Alex Weiser, YIVO's Public Programs Director, and I'm here with Neil W. Levin, YIVO's Annie E. Leibowitz Visiting Professor in Residence in Music. We're here to talk about our festival, Continuing Evolution Yiddish Folk Song Today. We're really excited for this festival. And the first topic of discussion is, what is a folk song? So, Neil, what is a folk song?
Well, the two parts of the word, because it is accepted now as one word, folk song, um, are folk and song. Um, and I don't think it makes any difference what the cultural or ethnic or national origin or background or context of folk song is. I am pretty certain, although I don't know a lot about non-Western cultures musically, other than Jewish non-Western cultures. But I think it's pretty safe to say that every ethnicity, every national group has a tradition of folk song. Um, and so in some respects, Yiddish folk song fits right in or under that umbrella. So it is good to get an idea of what we mean in the first place. So song, even song, is not as obvious as it may sound, because not only in Hebrew, where the word shir means poem as well as song, even in the tradition of folk song pamphlets or books or so forth in English, it used to be very common for someone to acquire a book of Scottish folk songs and open it up, and there's not a note of music in there. It's just the words. So there, even in other cultures, there are some needs sometimes to make sure that we mean the musical part of it. In other words, something to sing. Um, and of course, the bigger question is the folk. Who are or who is, could be either one, the folk? What is the folk? The very term in German, the Volksgeist or Volkslieder and so forth, but the idea of a folk spirit, the Volksgeist, is very much a 19th century German romantic notion, which became enlarged to apply to whole nations and whole countries, and by the 1930s in Germany in a very negative way too. But in principle, the folk is the common man, the grassroots, um, and it's sometimes called the masses. And we could ask each question: who are the masses? Who are the common man? But eventually, it comes down to one of those things about which people say, "quote You know what I mean," unquote. It means the largest or larger group of the common masses, the grassroots, the people, as it were. But of course, there's a lot of overlap. Uh, and then at one time, it was assumed in Western cultures, because I'm speaking primarily about Western cultures, that the folk was ipso facto the peasantry, or even the bourgeois peasantry, even but the rural folk. And then we had industrialization. So then we have what I hesitate to use the word because it's so Marxian, but what Marx called the proletariat, the, the city folk who are the working classes, the factory workers, whatever. And they also become part of the folk. You end up having in certain countries in Europe by the 19th century rural folk song, and working class or proletariat folk songs that people sing to themselves either at work or about their work and so forth. So, in the long stretch of things, we'll see when we talk about Yiddish folk songs among the various categories, lullabies. Well, lullabies are probably part of every folk song culture. So, it can be that a lullaby expresses particular values of a particular culture, but there are some things that all civilized uh, cultures have in common. Uh, and getting a baby to sleep is probably one of them. So, taken together, uh, that's what folk song is what the folk sing, and that to which the folk can relate, which is a very important thing. I
So,
think
yeah,
that
go on.
the primary thing about folk song, and this applies to instrumental music too, which you call folk music, folk song. There are two things I'd like to uh, kind of get out of the way from the beginning. One of them is the misassumption that ipso facto a folk song cannot be a composed song by someone. And that comes from the slight misunderstanding sometimes of the word anonymous. Now, a folk song could be anonymous, but it doesn't even have to be anonymous. What does anonymous mean? It means we don't know. It doesn't mean there isn't someone who composed it, whether it's the tune or the text or both. It just means it is not known or not known for certain. In the 19th century German Romanticism, the notion was spread quite astoundingly by highly educated people, by the way, that folk song just came out of the ether, that nobody ever composed it. I mean, it's surprising, in Jewish terms, somebody as intellectual as Edelson, Avram Tzvi Edelson, they considered the father of Jewish musicology, and in some simplistic short definitions, even refers to that kind of thing in his writings, because it was very much a German romantic notion. But the truth is, every tune or every poem has to be composed by somebody. It doesn't materialize out of thin air. And it's unlikely that there were committees that sat down around a table and said, okay, let's compose a song. But it is true in many cases, depending upon which culture, in most cases, that we don't know for certain the origin. We may know how it developed, we may know who first reduced it to writing, but that's after the fact. That's totally after the fact. When I say writing, I mean written words for the poem, or I mean musical notation for the tune. But somebody had to make it up, or at least make up the very first iteration of it. Now, sometimes through research, and sometimes even without the necessity of research, we know who actually composed a folk song, tune and text. Let's make it simple. But then, and we'll get to this when we talk more about Yiddish folk song, then there is a process that we now call folklorization. It's a recent term. I'm not sure, but I think that our own beloved Chaim Lotek coined the term. And some coinings go too far. This one is perfect because it's exactly what happens. Because, and this leads me to the probably most important aspect of what makes folk song, is not so much how it began, but how it is disseminated among the folk. And that we call oral transmission. In some circles today, even in academic societies, instead of oral transmission, it's called, or instead of even folk song, it's called traditional music. And that can be a little misleading, but I believe even at least one of the major academic societies in the United States uses the term something of traditional music. What they mean is folk music. That's exactly what is meant, not more, not less. It doesn't mean that a culture, for example, a German middle class and up culture, and even low, beneath middle class sociologically, by the late 19th century, had a tradition of loving high art music. So that word tradition can have a lot. There's such a thing as the classical tradition, but without those adjectives or modifiers, traditional music in the English language has meant folk song or folk music, instrumental folk music, transmitted orally. And because it is transmitted orally, finding it written down is an after the fact thing. That is someone who went to the folk or heard it sung by the folk and decided to notate it. But before that happens, what's going to happen when people sing songs for themselves? It's going to undergo a process of variation automatically. And we all know people who, when hearing us relay a folk song, they say, oh, yeah, but I knew it a little differently. And my grandmother sang it this way or that way. There is no right and wrong because there is no urtext. There's no original. If you have a Beethoven sonata, there is an urtext. Of course, he changed his mind a lot too, but what he approved for the publication. Oh, you can say, okay, there are different manuscripts that say this or that, but there's something to go on where by changing the note altogether, it's just wrong. Unless you acknowledge that you want to do that for some reason and you admit you're doing that. The same thing is true of poetry or any folk transmitted tale. It undergoes a process of variation. So we have in folk song what are called variants, and any folk song we choose to sing is a variant because there's no one original and then variants. Or if there was, we have no way of knowing what it was. What is a legitimate variant? Something I just make up? No. What makes it a legitimate variant is the fact that it was sung that way by some element of the folk. Not just that I decided to do it that way, because otherwise it's not part of a tradition. Now, I'd like to make another point here, which is a common mistake that people confuse the words variants and versions. A version is a music of a text, whether it's a religious text or a folk text or a secular folk text. Two different versions don't mean two different variants. They mean two completely different melodies, unrelated to each other. So for the same text, variants are of two kinds, and you could have one or the other or both in a given rendition of a folk song. There's a text variant and a tune variant, or a text-tune variant. The variants can be substantial, such that any layman could notice right away that it's a little different. One phrase, one note sometimes could make all the difference in the world because it could change the modality. Or it could be something so minute that ethnomusicologists have to be sure that that minute difference really was the way some group of the folks sang it. It could be an ornament or the absence of an ornament. It could be a different preposition in the text variant and so forth. But all of these are variants. That brings us to the matter of structure, because then there are going to be variants in structures. Among the various types, we're not going to list all of them here, of folk songs are strophic or non-strophic. And then after that, if it's strophic, is it simple strophic or complex strophic? What is a strophe? A strophe is the musical analog to a stanza in a poem. The word verse is a complete misuse. Verse, the word verse means poetry. Recite us some verse, please, Alex. How'd you like to recite us some verse by Heine or something? The only exception to that is the Bible. If you look in an authoritative dictionary, you will see that the one exception where verse 7, verse 8 is the Bible, but only the Bible. So what is meant really is in poetry, it's stanzas. In folk and song, it's whether it doesn't have to be a folk song, could be an art song too. It's strophes. Now, you have the first strophe, second strophe, third strophe. If it may be telling a story, maybe a ballad, or it may be each strophe just has a, a second, a third, a fourth related expression of the general theme of the poem, of the text. Then there is strophic with refrain and strophic without refrain. That can get complex too. The simple one is the refrain is exactly the same every time in among the strophes after each strophe. Some cultures have more traditions of complexity in the refrains than others, and we see this, by the way, the same thing in synagogue hymns, for example, congregational hymns, where I could point to ones that we all know, those of us who go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, where the refrain is a little different every time, has one different word each time. That's complex refrain. Others where the refrain is the same every time. And then, of course, you can move to the next thing where the strophes are not exactly the same each time in terms of theme. They introduce a new theme, which then brings us finally to the connection to variants, which is a fascinating matter of discovery still going on of new to us, that is, additional strophes that we didn't know existed in some town or among some community. I mean, Chaim Lotek was always finding until the day she stopped working. And ethnologists and ethnomusicologists both are constantly finding and becoming fascinated with finding yet another strophe that my grandmother didn't know about, or something like that. So in strophic folk songs, it's very, very risky to say there are 5 strophes and that's it. It's enough that, I mean, I don't know how many people, for example, know in the United States, let's say even American citizens, how many know, or for that matter, how many need to know, how many strophes there are to the Star Spangled Banner, or to America the Beautiful. I only know because I had an extraordinary 4th grade teacher. And she made us learn all 4. I think it's 4 because I'm going back to 4th grade, but I'm pretty sure it's at least 4. I suppose someday somebody could find a 5th strophe, because both of those really qualify from the point of view of the tunes as folk song. I mean, Star Spangled Banner, everybody thinks that written by Francis Scott Key. No, that's just the words written by Francis Scott Key. And then let's take that for a second. Almost everybody has turned it into a variant, except that we have some control over that by beginning it on the downbeat. Oh, say, that's not it. It's oh, say. And that's the only way that the accentuation of the words make any sense, because otherwise it's the bumps bursting. Well, it's not the bumps bursting, it's the bumps bursting in air, because the tune already existed when Francis Scott Key's words were put to it. It's very similar to the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. I mean, how many people think it is on the downbeat, da-da-da-dam, when it is da-da-da-dam, and so forth. But there's right and wrong, because there's an urtext. There's no question about it. So variants and additional strophes are both fascinating things in folk song. And when we get to Yiddish folk song, I'll talk a little bit more about parodies, because I'm sure that many cultures have the concept of parody folk songs, but I'm not sure that all of them do. But in the case of Yiddish folk song, it's a very important subgrouping.
Before we move on to Yiddish folk song, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about folk song concerts, folk song arrangements, folk songs in concert music. Um, you know, what are some of the different guises that we'll hear folk songs outside of these original contexts of the folk singing that you were describing?
Glad you used the word concert music because this brings us to the endless confusion about what to call what we all know means something. I mean, for many years in my a well-known stubbornness, I refused to use the word classical music unless I was speaking about the classical period in music. I finally gave in, but it's not ideal. And we had a conference on this in Potsdam at the university. I think it was in 2000. Well, this was one in 2004, actually. One of one of the conferences that Yasha Nemtsov organized. And I remember the subject came up, and I remember some people of the older generation saying, "Well, what about they remembered calling what we call classical music long-haired music." But I said, but that stopped applying in the 1960s when long hair meant something different. Uh, of course, there's art music, but even I don't like that because it has a certain limitation to it, art music. I mean, then what is art and what is this and all that? And then what you said, people have tried using the word concert music. It's it's more art music than it's concert music because you can have all kinds of concerts. I mean, concert simply means together. That's all it means. Uh, and in that case, it's the togetherness of the composer, the audience, and the performer or the interpreter. But the best term is never going to become official, but it is cultivated. And to my students, usually on the first day or two of any class, I used to teach every year, one semester on Yiddish and Hebrew folk song. I would make the following analogy. In botany, you have wildflowers or you have cultivated flowers. Just take roses, for example. There are wild roses and there are cultivated roses, which take a lot of work and a lot of, I'm told in some cases, daily work. But one is not more beautiful than the other. One is cultivated, which is a conscious, deliberate process and necessary. And the other didn't just get there. The wildflowers had to be planted by the wind, blowing some seeds, but they didn't emerge out of nowhere. So I would say that the counterpart to the wildflower is the folk song. Uh, to to cultivated music that has to be developed consciously and is a statement of the developer, namely the composer. Um, we can refer to it if we want as classical music, as long as we all know what we mean. But we don't even know then because there's gray areas all the time. There are gray areas all the time. I'm not sure that jazz isn't extemporaneous, improvised, but still a concert or classical music. I mean, it's certainly not folk music. So it's a category all of its own. But the notion of a folk music concert is a 20th century invention for certain. Because some of us might, I don't know if they teach, well, they don't teach music in public schools anymore, but I can still remember our music teacher pointing this out in fifth grade, something called the triangle in art music, in classical music, which means that even though people played classical music for themselves, oh my goodness, I mean, especially in the upper classes, I mean, they sang Schubert songs for themselves, not only for Schubertiadas, not only for gatherings. People sat down and learned pieces on the piano for themselves that were classical, but they were composed largely for an audience. So in classical music, you have the triangle, the three thing. You have the composer, you have the performer dash interpreter, and you have the audience. And the audience is just as much a part of that triangle as the other 2 points. But in folk music, you don't have an audience in its natural habitat because folk songs are sung and heard by the same people. People sit around singing them. If someone sings one to others, it's only so the others can learn it and the next day be singing it. So the audience and performer are the same thing, and the composer is anonymous. And even if we know who it was and folklorize it, it doesn't make any difference. It makes no difference whatsoever. So the notion of performing a folk song from a stage to an audience is very much a 20th century phenomenon. Um, I can remember um, in the immediate, well, let's say, in 1950s, there were 2 names that I can remember. There were probably others who were singing not in clubs, but in actual small concert halls. But even someone as famous as Burl Ives, who was probably more famous in the movies, I don't know, but he's pretty famous as a folk singer of folk songs in 30 languages, which, by the way, never included Hebrew or Yiddish. Um, and the other one was Richard Dyer Bennett. I'm sure there were others, but I remember their names at uh, festivals such as the Ravinia Festival and things like that. But they could not possibly attract more than 300 or 400 people in an audience, even in New York City. Um, and then folk song performed by someone for someone started in the clubs, as it were, whether it's Greenwich Village clubs in New York or the attempted imitating them in what they called Old Town in Chicago a little later, and throughout the country. But in those clubs, what one heard before the war was jazz, and then before that, blues and dance music and so forth. Um, so you started to have folk clubs, and from there, it became so successful that it graduated to folk song concerts. So the notion that in the 1960s, a group such as Peter, Paul, and Mary could attract thousands of people, could fill a stadium, that was something that had really never happened before. Whether it's a folk singer who really was in a way intellectually involved in folk music research and performance, so forth, like Joan Baez, or there were or other groups uh, whose primary purpose was still commercial. I mean, the purpose of a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert was commercial, to make money for the manager, to make money for the group, which is not a bad thing. No one is saying it's a bad thing, but that's already taking folk music and saying, here, let me show you what was folk music. And then came the folk song style, which meant to compose additional songs in a quote folksy unquote style, which makes perfect sense if one understands what that means. It means a certain simplicity in the positive sense, a simplicity that would have resonated with a folk, both in terms of text and tune, which an audience could pick up on hearing once or twice, and which they did, didn't they? Even for 5,000 people, people either were asked to join along or joined along without being asked to join along, which they would not be able to do if the text were a Shakespearean sonnet uh, or a John Milton poem that required analysis first in order to make any sense. Or similarly, if the tune were very elaborate. Although, as I mentioned before, it's interesting that some non-Western cultures, or certainly non-Western European cultures, uh, we find have had folk song traditions with musical complexities that would be very difficult for Western audiences to pick up right away. But that's a cultural thing. So uh, when you are when you're dealing with a folk song concert, um, as started, let's just say in the 50s on a large scale, of the late 50s, then comes the question of accompaniment. Now, it depends upon which ethnicity and which culture we're talking about. There are folk song categories where a certain type of accompaniment is part of the original folk tradition. And the simplest example would be cowboy songs with acoustical guitar. But as we'll see in case of Yiddish folk song and many folk song cultures, the natural habitat of their singing among the folk, there is no accompaniment. But to relate to an audience, it would be very difficult for more than one or two songs um, to imitate that without some kind of accompaniment, to say nothing of keeping everyone in tune and all that sort of thing. So that becomes an art all in itself. How far to go without making it sound beyond the realm of folk music? And of course, the obvious thing in the clubs to start with was acoustical guitar. It kind of worked when Theo Bickel put out one of the first LP. I know a lot of people aren't going to know what I mean. Long play, 33 and a third vinyl records that was largely successful. I mean, there were others before that, but I mean that sold across the country an album of Yiddish folk song. He did it with acoustical guitar, but in such a way that it did not overpower the the folk nature of the song. Now, then there were those quote unquote purists among academics. One I won't mention his name. We're very good friends. We used to argue about this all the time. And he carried on that that should never be done because then it's no longer the folk song should be done. In his case, we were talking about certain categories, a certain subgroup of Jewish folk song, not Yiddish, but it would apply the same way. That is already it's already ruining the nature of the song if you have any accompaniment, because that's not how it was sung. To which I always said, look, what you're talking about is correct for a lecture recital, not a concert. For a lecture recital, the folk song that's being sung is an illustration. That's something else. But you can't very well have what you could have with a chorus, totally a cappella, because it was composed a cappella and so forth. But when it comes to folk music, you probably need something. So the notion of creating an accompaniment for folk song recitals, folk song concerts, became an art all in itself. And I think I can say, as far as Yiddish and Hebrew folk song, there are very few people now who can do it, who know how to do it just to the point where it is a tiny bit artistic, but not too much. And I could name just several who could do that. But then we get to the next thing, which we'll talk about with Yiddish folk song, where we're talking about going several steps further. And going through that kind of gray area from light gray to dark gray or dark gray to light gray, I'm not sure which, or I don't know that it makes any difference, between folk song and art song. By art song, we mean in German, Kunstlied, Kunstlieder, Schubert, Schumann, Rachmaninoff, Grieg, Nedrorum, and so forth. Songs written to be performed with, in the case of Kunstlieder, with piano, but for a group. It doesn't have to be a concert. It could be a Liederabend in someone's home, or it could even just be for the two people doing it. But those are composed songs by Schubert and so forth. Now, there's an area in between where a composer deliberately will take a folk song and even leave deliberately every note of it as he heard the variant or saw the variant in a folk song collection intact, didn't mess with it, but created a piano part that is no longer an accompaniment, but a piano part that is so artistic that that song might as well be an art song. And the big question always is, well, would it be appropriate to include that on an art song recital? And if the answer is yes, then it's the kind of thing about which I'm talking. I think when we come to Yiddish songs, we'll talk about examples, but in Ladino, the best example is the set of songs by Alberto Hemsi, where not one note of the vocal line is adjusted even from the variant that he chose to set with a very elaborate, I mean, it requires a virtuoso pianist to play those things. So the piano then becomes just as important as the song. Well, that's already, as the vocal part, that's already one of the qualifications in theory of art song, that the piano part of a Schubert song is just as important as the vocal part. And I can remember my first summer ever at Aspen, the great voice teacher, one of the three great teachers at Juilliard in those days was Heinz. And he announced a masterclass for pianists only, who either played for singers, played with singers, I should say, art songs, lieder, or wanted to. And the first thing he's told us, I'll never forget this, he said, you know, if you are serious about wanting to perform lieder, whether it's German lieder, Schumann, Schubert, Brahms, whether it's Rachmaninoff, Russian lieder, whether it's Grieg, Norwegian, whatever it might be, you have to study at the very least and be in command of French and German. Of course, you want ideally Russian too, but since let's start with French and German. And of course, he was coming from a world in which that was simply a definition of an educated person, and not wrongly so. But he meant so that you can interpret the words in the same way that the singer can. So any singer who intends a career at least 50% in lieder is going to have to, on an undergraduate level, be in command of at least French and German, and then begin to add, let's say, Russian and so forth. But this came as a surprise to all the pianists, but we saw what he meant, we heard what he meant, we knew what he meant right away. So in that case, the accompaniment isn't an accompaniment. We should never refer to the piano part in a Schumann song as accompaniment, because it's not. It's the piano part. So once one moves in that direction as a composer, as you have done, with a folk song, you're edging towards an art song. And it doesn't have to be either one or the other, because you have a lot of gray area in between. And in the case of Hebrew, there's a famous case of the Hans Nathan collection, where quite a number of very famous composers, or very soon to be famous composers, so we know all of them now, were asked, including Aaron Copland, who we'll talk about later, were asked to take what was by that time considered a Hebrew Palestinian folk song, even if we knew exactly who wrote the tune and the text, but it was sung in folk song settings by the chalutzim, the pioneers on the on kibbutzim, or in urban settings too, as urban folk songs by workers and so forth. So it didn't matter whether we know who composed tune, text, or both or not. We began to call those Hebrew Palestinian folk songs, and we still call them those. Or later it became Songs of the Land of Israel with a capital L, because they came from different Aliyah periods beginning in the 19th century. And this musicologist, Hans Nathan, had a brainstorm. I mean, there were a lot of reasons for it. These songs, how were they disseminated? Some of us might remember, I don't remember, but I have a collection of postcards. They were disseminated in musical notation on postcards instead of pictures. And the money went to the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund, established in 1901, was the organization that purchased the land from Arabs, in some cases from Turks, but mostly from Arabs who had been downtrodden by the Turks. And they purchased the land at many times its actual value. And that was the origin of this kibbutz and that kibbutz and so forth. So the money from the sale of the postcards went to the Jewish National Fund. And on every postcard, one learned a Hebrew Palestinian folk song. This was before it became common to have them in soft cover folk song books, or hardcover for that matter, that you could buy at a music store or so forth. But those songs were set by these, in some cases, very sophisticated composers, giving them free rein, so long as they didn't change any of the vocal line. And those also can be done on art song programs, because composers such as Aaron Copland or Darius Milhaud or Stefan Volpe were not about to simply write accompaniments. They were writing piano parts, but with the view of their being performed to an audience. So in a nutshell, we have the folk song concert idea in its development. Now, when in the late 50s, let's say, and certainly by the 60s, people in suburban areas of New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, you name it, sat around singing Peter, Paul, and Mary songs. I mention that only because I went to more of their concerts than and Joan Baez too, and Judy Collins and so forth, than most of the others. But when they would sing, let's say, Puff the Magic Dragon, I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, that's a composed song. I don't think that's a folk song. But everything about it is folksy. What's folksy? It's simple. There's nothing to interpret. You don't need Freudian analysis. You don't need French deconstruction for the words. It wouldn't do any good. It's not necessary. The song can be learned in one hearing, and it's fun. However, if someone had said at a party, wait a second, that's wrong. How could you prove that it was wrong? Put it on the record, that's how. So that's already outside the oral transmission. They were transmitted orally from stage to concert seats, but that's not what we mean by oral transmission. What we mean is, by oral transmission, is it was learned in one area by somebody who had visited relatives in another town, and they sat around singing a folk song. By the time he got back to his town, he already, without thinking about it, had remembered it a little differently, and so forth. And that's what variants of oral transmission mean.
Neil, thank you so much. Let's pause here, and we'll return shortly for Yiddish folk song in particular.